My boss and her old friend both trusted me with a secret, and suddenly, I was caught between them. I still remember the first morning it happened, the quiet way the office seemed to hum around me. The sunlight slipped through the blinds, dust motes floating lazily in the air, catching the edges of folders and papers scattered across the desk. I had barely settled into my chair when she appeared, my boss, elegant and composed, moving with that quiet authority that made it impossible not to notice her. There was a soft warmth in the air around her, a mix of perfume and coffee, subtle but intoxicating. Her eyes, sharp yet gentle, flicked toward me as she handed over a folder. Her fingers brushed mine for just a second, the kind of touch that makes you aware of the contact long after it's gone. I felt a small jolt, a flutter of something I couldn't quite name. She didn't linger, but the pause in her smile hinted at unspoken thoughts, a trust one wasn't yet fully aware of. Then there was her friend. Older, yes, but with a playful warmth that balanced her friend's poise. She had a laugh that filled the corners of the office like sunlight spilling across the floor. When she leaned in to speak to me, her shoulder lightly touching mine, it wasn't just casual closeness. There was a comfort in it that made me feel seen, as if I were quietly stepping into a world I wasn't supposed to fully understand yet. It was in that small, strange confluence of moments, her trust, her friend's ease, that I first realized I was being drawn into something I wasn't prepared for. Both of them leaned toward me, their voices low and measured, sharing that they needed me to keep a secret. They didn't explain fully. They never do. Not yet. But the weight of it pressed on me, a mix of responsibility and curiosity that made it hard to concentrate on the mundane tasks at hand. I noticed the little things that morning. How my boss's hand lingered on the edge of the desk, the faint tremor in her fingers as if she, too, carried a quiet nervousness. How her friend's eyes met mine a second too long, playful but searching, as if gauging my reaction. Even the way they smiled at me felt charged, subtle sparks hidden beneath layers of casual composure. I sat there, heart slightly racing, realizing that trust had been placed in me before I even fully understood why. It wasn't just a secret. It was an invitation into a delicate, intimate space, one I wasn't sure I had permission to enter emotionally. And yet, there was no denying the pull I felt, the curiosity that lingered in every glance and light touch. By the time I returned to my work, the office seemed a little smaller, the air a little warmer, and the silence between tasks filled with unspoken possibilities. That day, I learned that some secrets carry more than information. They carry feelings, tension, and the quiet promise of something I wasn't ready to name. Over the next few days, I began to notice the contrast between them more clearly, small details that made my chest tighten in ways I wasn't prepared to analyze. My boss carried herself with an effortless elegance, every movement precise, every word measured. Yet, beneath that polished exterior, there was a softness I hadn't noticed at first, an almost imperceptible vulnerability when she thought no one was watching. It was in the way her fingers brushed her notes, slightly trembling, or how her gaze lingered a little too long on me when she handed over instructions. Those moments felt electric, charged with something unspoken. Her friend, on the other hand, was warmth and ease personified. She laughed freely, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made it impossible not to smile in response. She had a way of leaning in close while speaking, letting her shoulder brush mine ever so slightly, the touch casual but intimate. Each time it happened, I felt an unexpected shiver run down my spine, a magnetic awareness that made me acutely conscious of her presence. Her gestures were unguarded, yet there was an unspoken depth behind her laughter, a sense that she too carried something private I was not fully aware of. It wasn't just their physical presence, it was the emotional gravity they both seemed to carry. I found myself observing how they interacted with the world around them and with me, trying to decode the subtle signals they were sending. When my boss leaned against the desk for a quick chat, the faint scent of her perfume seemed to linger on my fingers long after she stepped away. When her friend brushed a stray hair behind her ear, the warmth of her skin nearly stayed imprinted in my mind. Every small gesture, every fleeting touch, became charged with meaning I couldn't fully articulate. There were moments during those days when both of them would catch me off guard. A quiet glance from my boss in a crowded meeting room, a fleeting smirk from her friend across the table during lunch. Each carried a silent invitation, a recognition of the secret we shared. And yet, neither of them pushed, neither made a move that crossed the boundaries of propriety. It was a delicate dance, one that left my heart pounding while my mind tried to rationalize the pull I felt. Internally, I struggled with the weight of their trust. The secret they had asked me to guard wasn't just information. It was an emotional anchor, a thread connecting us in ways I was only beginning to understand. With each shared glance and subtle touch, the tension between admiration, curiosity, and something more grew, teasing the edges of desire without ever naming it. By the end of the week, I realized I was no longer just observing them. I was part of a delicate web of emotions, one where every smile, every gentle touch, every fleeting look carried a significance I couldn't ignore. It was in these quiet, intimate moments, small and almost invisible to the outside world, that the slow burn of connection began to take hold, leaving me both exhilarated and uncertain about what I truly felt. As the days passed, the secret they had entrusted to me began to feel heavier. It wasn't just a piece of information. It was a delicate weight, a fragile trust that demanded care and attention. Every time I glanced at my boss across the office, I saw it reflected in her eyes, a quiet vulnerability, almost imperceptible, masked beneath her polished professionalism. The way she held a cup of coffee, her fingers wrapping around it as though drawing strength from the warmth, spoke volumes more than her words ever could. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort without breaking the unspoken boundaries, but I was painfully aware of the distance that decorum demanded. Her friend, in contrast, seemed lighter at first glance, breezy even. Yet, there were moments when her playfulness faltered, replaced by a thoughtful pause that betrayed the seriousness of the secret we shared. Once, during a quiet lunch in a nearly empty cafe, her hand brushed mine ever so lightly as she reached for her glass, and it lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. That fleeting warmth traveled up my arm, leaving a memory of her presence that I couldn't shake. It was in those small, almost accidental touches that I began to sense the depth of the connection forming between us. The tension grew not from confrontation, but from proximity and unspoken understanding. Each interaction with them became a careful navigation, how close I could stand, how long our eyes could meet before the moment became too loaded. When my boss leaned over to show me a chart, her shoulder pressed against mine just enough to send a subtle jolt through me. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, the gentle sway of her posture, the calm confidence hiding a trace of unease. I wanted to ask her questions, to probe gently, but the secret was sacred, and my respect for that boundary only intensified my internal conflict. Her friend brought a different kind of tension, a warmth and ease that made honesty feel natural. In our conversations, her gaze often lingered, searching, assessing, almost daring me to meet the unspoken question in her eyes. The lightness of her laughter, the casual brush of her hand against mine during a shared joke, made the secret feel less like a burden and more like a thread weaving us together. Yet even in these moments of comfort, I could feel the emotional stakes, the invisible walls each of us had built around our feelings. It became clear that the secret was not merely about concealment. It was a vessel for trust, a bridge to emotional intimacy. Every small gesture, every shared glance or accidental touch, was magnified by the knowledge that we were in this together. I found myself thinking of them constantly, replaying brief encounters in my mind, aware of how profoundly their presence affected me. The weight of the secret had become entwined with my growing awareness of them, not just as individuals, but as women who were slowly, subtly opening their worlds to me. By the end of the week, I felt caught in a quiet, tantalizing tension. I was no longer just the recipient of a secret. I was a participant in an emotional choreography, where each gesture and glance carried unspoken meaning. The burden of secrecy had transformed into a delicate intimacy, leaving me both exhilarated and uncertain, and painfully aware that nothing would ever be quite the same again. By this point, the subtle rhythms of our interactions had developed a life of their own. The office, once just a place of work, had become a stage for moments charged with unspoken feelings. Every glance, every accidental brush of skin, carried a significance I could no longer ignore. The secret we shared had created an invisible thread connecting the three of us, a quiet tension that hummed beneath even the most mundane tasks. My boss, always poised and controlled, had moments when the weight of her trust softened her edges. One afternoon, she called me into her office under the guise of discussing a report. As I stepped closer, she handed me the folder, and our fingers brushed. That brief touch lingered in my mind longer than it should have, the warmth radiating through my skin and settling somewhere deep in my chest. She gave a small, knowing smile, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of us, the quiet rustle of papers, the faint hum of the air conditioner, and the steady rhythm of her presence. Her friend added a different, unpredictable energy. We met for a casual coffee after work, ostensibly to talk about something unrelated, but the air between us was anything but casual. When she leaned forward to emphasize a point, her elbow brushed mine. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent a ripple through me, a mixture of excitement and hesitation. Her laughter, warm and light, drew my gaze to hers again and again. There was something about the way she observed me, the way her eyes lingered, that made me acutely aware of my own reactions, the quickened heartbeat, the subtle tension in my shoulders, the warmth spreading across my chest. Being around them together was even more complicated. During a quiet moment in a shared meeting room, I found myself seated between them. My legs brushed hers slightly, and the proximity felt both natural and charged. Their occasional glances at each other, then back at me, created a silent triangle of awareness, each of us attuned to the other's movements and moods. The secret we held amplified every gesture, every fleeting touch, every pause in conversation. I became hyper-aware of how close my hand was to theirs on the table, how the slightest shift in posture brought an almost imperceptible heat to my skin. I felt the push and pull of desire and restraint. I admired their grace, their warmth, and the depth of the trust they placed in me. Yet I also feared overstepping the unspoken boundaries. My mind raced through possibilities. How far could these subtle touches go? Was it acceptable to let my gaze linger a little longer? Could I allow myself to feel the tension without crossing a line? And yet, despite the restraint, there was a delicious intensity to the unspoken connection. Every shared glance, every accidental touch, every quiet smile was magnified by the secret we guarded together. It was a slow-burn fire, one that simmered beneath our interactions, building a sense of intimacy and attraction that neither words nor actions could fully contain. By the end of the day, I realized that I was walking a fine line, caught between admiration, responsibility, and desire, and that line had never felt so thrillingly alive. The tension that had quietly simmered for days finally began to take shape as something more fragile and human. Both women started letting pieces of themselves show, small cracks in the otherwise composed facades, revealing layers of vulnerability I hadn't expected. My boss, who always seemed to command the room with effortless authority, had moments when the weight of the secret, and perhaps her own unspoken struggles, made her pause in ways that drew my attention. One evening, she called me into her office under the pretense of reviewing documents, but the moment I stepped in, I noticed her hands fidgeting with the edge of a paper, her eyes softer than usual. "Sometimes," she said quietly, her voice lower than I'd ever heard it, "it's easier to trust someone else than to carry it alone." There was no demand for reassurance, no overt plea, just the quiet truth of her confession. Her fingers lightly brushed the corner of the folder she handed me, and the subtle warmth of that touch lingered, anchoring me in the moment. I wanted to offer comfort, to reassure her in a way that words could barely capture. I reached for her hand, not to intrude, but to convey that I understood, that I was there. The slight pressure of my palm against hers, and the faint tremor in her grip, created an intimacy that transcended ordinary conversation. Her friend revealed her own vulnerability differently, through warmth rather than restraint. During a casual walk in the park, she laughed softly at my nervous attempts to comment on a trivial matter. Then her tone softened. "It's not always easy, you know," she murmured, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "To know who to trust, or how to feel when you do." Her shoulder brushed mine as we walked side by side, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her presence, the rhythm of her steps mirroring mine. There was a softness to her gaze, an almost imperceptible invitation to meet her openness with my own honesty. In those moments, I realized the secret was no longer just about information. It was a conduit for emotional closeness. Each confession, each subtle gesture, created a safe space where we could acknowledge feelings without naming them outright. My heart swelled with the responsibility and the privilege of being trusted, but it also ached with the intensity of my own unspoken emotions. We didn't need to verbalize desire. It was implied in every lingering look, in the warmth of fingertips brushing against mine, in the shared silence that spoke louder than words. The air seemed to hum with possibilities, but we moved cautiously, aware of boundaries and the fragile nature of trust. The connection between us deepened not through overt declarations, but through these quiet, charged moments of honesty and closeness. By the end of that day, I understood that the secret had evolved into something far more intimate, a bridge linking our hearts, a space where vulnerability and subtle desire coexisted. I felt both exhilarated and nervous, caught in the slow, intoxicating pull of a connection that was as delicate as it was undeniable. The slow burn had reached a new intensity, one that promised that nothing between us would ever be the same again. The days that followed the confessions were quieter in some ways, yet heavier in feeling. The secret remained, but the weight of it had shifted. It was no longer just a burden. It had become a bridge, connecting us in ways that neither words nor touches could fully explain. There was still tension, but it had softened into something warmer, something tender, a slow, deliberate intimacy that lingered in small, meaningful gestures. I noticed the changes first in the way my boss interacted with me. There was a gentleness in her tone, an almost imperceptible softness in her posture. When she handed me a folder, her fingers lingered slightly longer at mine, and she offered a brief, reassuring smile that carried more weight than any words could. Sometimes, during discussions, she would guide my hand to a document, her touch deliberate yet casual, as though our physical proximity had become a natural extension of trust. It was in these moments that I realized how much the quiet closeness between us had grown, how the unspoken tension had transformed into mutual understanding. Her friend approached the connection differently, through warmth and ease. We spent an afternoon together outside of work, walking through the park in companionable silence. Her hand brushed mine several times, intentionally or not, and each time the contact sent a quiet ripple of awareness through me. She laughed softly at something trivial, but when our eyes met, the playfulness deepened into something more significant, a subtle acknowledgement of our shared intimacy. Her gestures, unguarded and natural, created a comforting space where I could be myself without the weight of formality or expectation. The most delicate moments occurred when all three of us were together. There was a shared awareness, a rhythm to our interactions that was quietly charged yet fully respectful. When I passed a file to one of them, our hands met briefly, and the other's gaze lingered, acknowledging the unspoken connection. Sitting near each other during meetings, brushing past shoulders, or sharing the occasional quiet laugh, we navigated the closeness with care, aware of boundaries, but also of the tender tension that now existed between us. In these moments, the affection was small but deeply meaningful, a hand on the lower back guiding someone through a doorway, a reassuring touch on the shoulder during a tense conversation, a shared silence that felt like a private conversation of its own. These gestures allowed the tension to release gradually, without urgency, creating a warmth that filled the spaces between us. By the end of the week, I felt the shift clearly. The secret was still ours, but the emotional connection it had fostered was now steady, intimate, and safe. The earlier tension had softened into trust, admiration, and a quiet longing that didn't need to be named aloud. For the first time, I felt a sense of completion, a slow, deliberate satisfaction in knowing that the bond between us had grown without compromise, without rush, and with a depth that promised it could endure. The slow burn fire was no longer raw and consuming. It had become a steady warmth, radiating quietly in every glance, touch, and smile. And in that warmth, I realized that the journey we had begun with a secret had brought us to a place of shared understanding, subtle affection, and the promise of something lasting and profoundly human. The culmination of weeks of quiet tension, shared secrets, and fleeting touches finally settled into a moment of calm and connection. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. There were no sudden declarations or overt gestures, but the warmth between us was palpable, like sunlight slowly spilling across a room. The secret that had bound us together had become less of a weight and more of a tether, gently drawing us closer while allowing each of us the space to breathe, to think, and to simply be. It happened on a quiet evening in the office. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only the three of us lingering among the soft glow of desk lamps and the muted hum of the city outside. We sat together on the large, leather couch in the corner, each of us sipping tea that had long since cooled. My boss leaned slightly against the armrest, her head tilting just enough that the faint fragrance of her perfume reached me. Her friend sat close on the other side, her hand brushing mine as she laughed at something trivial, a sound so warm and light that it seemed to fill the room entirely. I became aware of every small sensation, the soft warmth of their proximity, the subtle rise and fall of their breaths, the rhythm of their hands moving almost unconsciously near mine. It was in these details that the intimacy truly existed, the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of trust and shared feeling. I felt a weight lift, a gentle release of the tension that had defined our interactions for so long, replaced with something steady, human, and reassuring. The emotional closeness between us allowed for moments of gentle affection. My head rested lightly near my boss's shoulder as we laughed at a shared memory, and her hand brushed softly against mine in an almost casual gesture that carried a world of meaning. Her friend leaned in slightly, her fingers lightly grazing my arm, and for a heartbeat, the three of us were suspended in a quiet, perfect balance of trust, warmth, and subtle attraction. There was no need for words. The connection was already fully formed, expressed through glances, light touches, and the ease of simply being together. In that moment, I realized that the secret had accomplished something unexpected. It had allowed us to see each other in ways that words alone could not express. It had created a space where vulnerability, admiration, and understated desire could exist without shame or confusion. The slow burn tension that had defined the past weeks now felt like a gentle glow, a warmth that promised the possibility of something enduring, deeply human, and quietly beautiful. As we lingered there, sharing a comfortable silence, I felt a profound sense of completion. The secret remained ours, yes, but it was no longer a source of tension or anxiety. It had become the framework for a subtle, intricate bond that respected boundaries while nurturing emotional connection. We were united, not just by the secret, but by the trust, affection, and unspoken understanding that had grown between us. And in that final, quiet moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The slow burn journey had reached its gentle, satisfying conclusion, a story of trust, warmth, subtle romance, and the quiet magic of human connection. It ended not with fireworks or grand declarations, but with the soft, enduring light of a bond fully realized, safe, tender, and beautifully complete.